in order to introduce myself, I'm Brittany Kaiser. I am what I like to call a data rights activist. And what that means to me is that I work to preserve your privacy, to protect your data, and make sure that we are building more ethical technology. So on a day-to-day basis, I work on data protection and privacy legislation and regulation with governments. I work on digital literacy education, so to teach people how to protect themselves online and lead a more successful digital life. And I advise technologists on how to use data protection and privacy protocols to build more ethical tools for the world. So how did I get here? If you want me to start from the beginning, I grew up in Chicago. And when I was young in high school, I got really into environmental activism, which led me into political activism. I was in Chicago, so one of my first big political engagements, I would say, is joining the first Obama campaign. And that's where I started working at the intersection of technology and politics. I joined the first Obama campaign, built Barack Obama's first Facebook page, and became part of the team that invented social media strategy. So in the very beginning of when people were deciding what to do to use social media to engage people, to do community organizing, to get people to care about issues that are incredibly important, or at least should be to them and their families, get people to register to vote for the first time, or to get involved in initiatives that are important and that positively affect their communities. That's what we were doing, really. And it was the very beginning of, I suppose, what is now called micro-targeting, which is to get basic amounts of data at the time. I mean, Twitter wasn't even being used. We had a Flickr account, a Bebo account, a MySpace for Barack Obama. So you can imagine that the rudimentary data sets we were collecting were quite basic. But if you knew just a little bit about someone, you could start to tailor emails to them. You could tailor phone calls to them. And you would be much more likely that they would get involved in a rally or a community event or donating to a particular cause. And I spent many years after the Obama campaign helping human rights NGOs and charities around the world build similar strategies. Now, when I got into college, I started training as a human rights lawyer and as a diplomat. So that meant engaging in quite a lot of human rights activism around the world. I started lobbying at the United Nations and the European Parliament, and also going to countries all over the place to do on-the-ground human rights research, sometimes human rights documentation about crimes that had been committed in countries, in order to build up campaigns to get people to care about certain issues, and obviously in the end to make a positive impact and a change in what was going on. So that was my background when I began writing my PhD, which was about preventive diplomacy. How do we prevent human rights violations before they happen? How do we prevent bad things from happening in countries before they do? And my research ended up being mostly about big data. What data sets did governments, militaries, nonprofits, NGOs, what did they have access to, and even companies, in order to build early warning systems? What's the data that gets into the hands of decision makers so that they can intervene in a situation before it becomes mass violence, before it becomes war, for instance? And that ended up being a lot about social media data, a lot about other data sets that were accessible so that you could use advanced predictive algorithms to predict anything from famine and inflation to war before it happened, and build the strategy to make sure that you could lessen human suffering. And that might seem like a really shocking time for me to join a company like Cambridge Analytica, but when I joined Cambridge Analytica, I was in the third year of writing my PhD, and no one at my law school could teach me about advanced predictive analytics. So I was introduced to the CEO at the time and introduced to a lot of the really exciting and what I saw as positive projects that they were doing around the world. I suppose some of the people listening to this might know me as the Cambridge Analytica whistleblower. So that was the beginning of a 3.5-year journey where I learned a lot more about data than I bargained for, and a lot about how communities, organizations, cities, governments, political parties, companies around the world use data in order to further their goals. Now, their goals are not always inherently positive, although at the time, my bright-eyed, bushy-tailed self liked to believe that that would be true. But I found out a lot of things about the data industry while I was working there. Namely that individuals who produce this asset, the world's most valuable asset. It wasn't in 2014, that started to be estimated in figures around 2017. But in 2014, it was still a very valuable resource around the world that most companies and governments were using. And I found out that the people who produce that, all of us, have absolutely no rights to that asset, even though we're the producers. And I started to question that. I started to have many red flags about this. And eventually, I was working within the company to build data ownership solutions where individuals who were producing their data would actually be able to transparently see who was collecting their data, where it was going, and have the option to opt out, or if they opted in to their data being used by organizations that were monetizing it, that they would actually see some of that revenue, either get a dividend or some sort of positive incentive or reward for deciding to share. And over those years, I learned a lot about the beginning of smart cities strategy, the beginning of how both local, national, and international organizations could use data for positive social impact. And I suppose that's why I stayed at the company for so long, because I do really believe in data science and AI. I do believe that using data is going to be the way that we solve most of humanity's problems, which is why I don't seek to tell everybody, claim your privacy, delete your data, and disappear out of the digital world. As we all see right now during these pandemic times when our entire lives are digital, that's not really an option for the majority of the planet. Our lives are becoming more and more digital, and they will continue to do so, especially as we go into a future of IoT and data science. So I think it's incredibly important for us to think about us as individuals. What rights are we going to have in the future? And again, this comes from me being trained as a human rights lawyer for nearly 10 years of law school. I think about what our rights are all of the time, how we enshrine our rights in a legislative and regulatory framework, how activist groups can continue to fight for our rights when we have encroachment and infringement, which we'll talk about later, what's currently going on during emergency legislation for our data to be taken from us. And I think that we all need to be very vigilant about what's going on now, because the situation with data rights wasn't great before coronavirus started, and now we're seriously under threat. So I'm really glad that you wanted to have this conversation today.